Hello everyone, we're back for another modern day debate Discord stage event. Today we're going to be talking about the historical validity of the flood narrative. We have with us Christian Anarchist and Cruux. I look forward to engaging debate, and without further ado, let's start with Christian Anarchist's opening statement.
Alrighty, so today we're debating, as was said, whether or not the flood narrative, as laid out in the Bible, is historically valid. All right. Now, of course, whether or not the flood, in terms of whether the flood happened, the short and long of it all is that we don't know. We don't actually know, if, one way or another, if the flood actually happened. But we can look at all the evidence that's in front of us and sort of get to a sort of probabilistic answer of what is most likely to have happened. Now, before we talk about the flood narrative in terms of like the evidence for it on either side, I want to sort of go into detail about sort of provide, I guess, a context as to what the flood narrative actually is and what we're actually going to be talking about. The idea behind the flood narrative is that there was a flood, which, well, see, the reason why I'm giving a prelude to this is because there's actually still debate whether the Bible is actually talking about a worldwide flood versus a local flood, whether or not the flood was inspired, or sorry, the flood narrative was inspired by a actual flood that seems to have influenced the Semitic people and even people all over the world, or if it's like if it was meant to be local or global sort of thing. Now, the reason why that's a lot more trickier than you might expect is because sometimes when the Bible uses all-encompassing language, especially in the earlier books like Exodus and Genesis, it isn't necessarily being literal, right? So when it says that the flood covers the face of the whole earth kind of thing, you can't actually know that it's being literal in saying covered the face of the whole earth, because we see, for example, in Exodus, that it uses very similar language. And I'll just read to you something for Exodus, and this is relevant. Throughout Egypt, hail will strike. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything down in the fields, both animals, people, and it beat everything down growing in the fields and stripped every tree. All right, so it seems like all the animals, all the people, and especially all of the trees and the greenery, they have been struck down. Okay, so that means there's no more trees, no more greenery, right? Well, in the very next chapter, um, uh, Exodus 10, Moses is bringing down a plague of locusts that's going to eat whatever greenery is left. And you're probably thinking, hang on, I thought all of the greenery was gone. I thought it was all completely and utterly destroyed. The Bible made that very clear. Well, apparently, from what we can tell, um, as a sort of literary device, the Bible when the Bible seems to be going into detail about cataclysmic events, it tends to use all-encompassing language, like they were all wiped out, it was all destroyed. It's sort of to hype up the drama and make it more dramatic, or at least that's a potential interpretation. Another very valid interpretation of the flood narrative is that yes, it's just supposed to be a global worldwide flood. Now, I'm going to be arguing that this flood that happened and the evidence for it is very omnipervasive, but I don't know about a global flood. Given that I believe from analyzing the way that the Bible structures its language and its literary techniques, I do not believe it is fundamentally necessary that it has to absolutely be a global worldwide flood, just a very big and sudden flood that affected the people of the area, not just the Hebrews, but also surrounding cultures and even cultures across continents. So, in talking about all that, what's the evidence for all that? Um, well, there's this thing called the Younger Dryas impact, or Younger Dryas impact theory. Basically, the idea is that there was these frozen ice sheets in the northern continents, and the idea is that a meteorite came and impacted those northern ice sheets, causing them to melt very, very rapidly and causing all sorts of global changes, which brought about the Younger Dryas uh, event, where global temperatures were changing extremely drastically and sea levels were rising. Now, of course, in terms of evidence for the Younger Dryas impact theory uh, being valid, this is something that divides some scholars, but there is, to an extent, sufficient evidence. I had a source up here which I was going to read from, but I don't have it up from me. I apologize. But basically, that there seems to be um, the sources about this talk about there being two categories of evidence. One category that has been dismissed completely, and another category of evidence that has scientists split. So, you know, it does seem that the Younger Dryas period, at the very least, um, has a very likely it's at least that sort of sets the very likely candidate for when this flood very likely took place. Um, so we do have evidence of sea levels rising during this time. Now, of course, it's debated still whether or not it was a rapid set of floods that happened at the time, or if it was sort of gradual sea levels rising gradually over the course of, say, 50 years or so, which caused flooding, but not as drastically as you might expect the Bible to. But again, it seems to be at every turn there's always a debate on this, a debate on that. People are still split. Um, Now, basically, the idea behind when the Bible talks about the Noah's flood, it doesn't just leave us completely clueless as to how this whole thing was supposed to happen. It does actually give us hints about what was like how this all took place. It doesn't really make much mention of any sort of meteorites or anything like that, but it does make a mention of, quote, the fountains of the deep opening up. So apparently there was supposed to be this underwater but water that rose up from the earth, and that was part of what it. And there was also apparently a portal in the heaven that caused rain. When, however you may interpret that, again, it's all up to heavy interpretation. But with regards to the underground water, though, we have actually found very recently in that scientists have discovered an underground ocean which has more water than all of the world's oceans combined. Sorry, all of the planet's oceans combined. Perhaps even 3 times over. We're not exactly sure how much is down there, but we do know it's quite a bit. There's this stone that's. Sorry, did I just cut out? Sorry.
It was minor. It's
Yeah,
okay.
sorry. There was a stone that was discovered called ringwoodite. Now, this stone tends to have properties of, I believe it sort of retains water to an extent. And basically, they've discovered that they've uh, found a lot of it beneath the Earth's crust, and it seems to be holding like an absolute shit ton of water, basically. So we do actually have evidence of something of an underground ocean being a part of the Earth's water cycle to an extent, and that's it's entirely possible that this underground ocean actually did uh, play a part in the Noah's flood incident. Now, of course, this is all very circumstantial evidence so far. You've got these underground oceans, potential Younger Dryas impacts. So what? What ties this all together? Well, you have all these uh, separate sources back in ancient history where the ancient world, not this isn't just in the Bible, the ancient world was pretty damn confident there was some sort of global flood, and they seem to tie it to the deities as well. You find this in not just the Bible, but the Epic of Gilgamesh. You find it in a couple of surrounding Semitic cultures. I won't go list all of them off, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is significant because it is actually the world's oldest story that we have today. Like, this is the oldest preserved story that we have, and it actually essentially makes mention of Noah. I don't think they call him Noah in it, but they do make mention of a guy who survived the, quote, the Great Flood, by building a boat and taking a bunch of animals on it. It certainly sounds familiar. Now, of course, there's also all over the world you have all over different continents you have different flood myths, um, and with very similar themes, where basically you have the gods were angry, a flood gets sent, and there are certain survivors which manage to survive the cataclysm. This is a common narrative that exists across different continents. I think there's some in South America, North America. There's even some in kind of Australia, but those theory narratives are a bit more disconnected. But you do find this pretty much all over the place. You don't tend to see this in Central Asia, and I don't think you see it anywhere in or too many places in Africa. But other than that, you pretty much see it pretty omnipervasive. Now, if this is just a cultural myth, like for example, if the Bible is drawing from a cultural myth, like from the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, then why is it you also see similar narratives across continents? What exactly is the common story they're all drawing from? Well, it seems to make more sense of the evidence that there was some sort of flood of some kind that was omnipervasive to an extent, and that it spawned all these different stories. Because the ancient world seems pretty damn confident that there was a flood. Why there was a flood, they all disagree. Some would say that it's because the gods were angry, or God was angry, or because apparently humans were making too much noise in one of the myths. But yeah, basically, so the evidence, just to sum up, you have the evidence of um, multiple myths throughout history, sort of drawing upon this equal event. You have the Younger Dryas impact, and you have the underground oceans, which all could culminate together to potentially piecing together to make up the Noah's flood, essentially. And I'll just stop talking there.
All right, and now for Crux's opening statement.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks, Buff. Can I share a screen? Is that possible? I think we can go. I wrote my stuff down. Work a little bit better that way. I hope that's okay. I'm just trying to find my window. Can you see that? Oh, went away. Buff, is that coming up?
Yep, yeah, I can see it. Can you guys see it? And if Max is recording, maybe he could just click on that to get it big.
It's okay. There are some pictures just
Nice.
further on, but I wanted to sort of start by thanking Christian for doing this discussion with me. We were involved in a few VCs or not VCs, rather the text chats where these things come up. So I wanted to have a chat about them. Yeah, and I agree as far as possibilities go. A lot of this stuff is unfalsifiable because we don't have all the evidence. So I would agree very much that that I can't say it's impossible that there was a flood. Okay, so like the fossil record, which I like to use, some of the people on here have argued before, you could say magical space unicorns put it there, or God put it there, or whatever you want. There's no way for me to say that that isn't the case. I can only go on the evidence that we sort of have in science. So in science, we can say that things are likely or unlikely, probable or improbable, and we've got no evidence for magical space unicorns. I know you haven't used that there, but I can only go on the sort of evidence that we see in the world. So I do concede that if something is not falsifiable, I can't say it's impossible, but I can say it's not possible beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, until we get evidence for it, I can say that something is not likely to be possible. Okay, so can I do that with the flood? I'd have to ask these sorts of questions. Is there evidence for it? I would say no, like natural evidence. Is there evidence against it? Yes. Is it likely that the entire world flooded? No, I would say it's not. And is there any evidence for that? I would say no, and I'll go into some of those. The underground water we were talking about, I found this is just a source from a newspaper that mentioned that there's 6 quintillion gallons of water in the upper 1.2 miles of the crust. This is from a study, a Canadian study by hydrogeologists. That would be akin to 182, 183 metres or 600 feet of water if you could get all that water up to the surface on top of what we already have. So we're only talking, I mean, that's a lot of water, an incredible amount of water, but would that be enough to justify the covering of all of the Earth's landforms? It wouldn't be. But, yeah, a lot of water. Okay, so we covered that. And if it came to the surface, how did it get there? And if it went away, how did it go away? The reason that that water is there is because it soaks down into the rocks that are beneath our feet. So how would that all come up at once to the surface, and how would it all drain away? Like what process? We'd have to know the process of how that happened, and I'm not sure that we can sort of justify that. How do we interpret the sedimentary evidence and the rock records? So I've done a geology degree. This is one of the places in Newcastle where I am. It's called the amphitheatre. It's a rock cliff 50 metres tall, and in that rock we can see different colours there of different rocks. We've got down the bottom, that's all sort of swampy mud stones full of Glossopteris fossils, which are found across the world, and we use that as evidence that all the continents were linked once, because that's a land fossil that is on every continent around the world. So we look at those sorts of ancient environments and the evidence that's left behind, and we say, like, how did that form? Up towards the top, there's sort of beach sediments, and then again another return to swampy conditions. Even further up the top, you can see the coal up there. These are the Newcastle coal measures. So we would look at our natural environment and would say, well, how do those things form? What sediments and fluids are involved, and how do they interact with each other? How are the layers laid down? What sort of features are formed as a result? Okay, so we'd be looking for like features we could have in an environment like that one, sand dunes and sand ripples that we can see in the rocks. We can see evidence of the swamp, fossils, sediment composition, like what's it made out of? Where did that come from? Evidence of storms and floods, and we can get a pretty clear idea of what the environment in that place at different times was. Okay, so in this one, I've already said what they are. There's some volcanic stuff mixed in amongst the swamp sediments and the beach sediments. What we would expect to see in a flood is massive layers of flood deposits in every rock of similar age across the planet. Now, if we're not talking that far back, then it would be sediments, not rocks. But we should still see the evidence of that. We should see people, animals, building structures all caught up in those flood layers. There should be sediments on top of buildings, and all of the animal evidence should be mixed in there. Okay, it's not what we see in the rocks and in the sediments. We have very clear progression of animals through time. Evidence of mass extinctions of land animals through the rock record of the flood. And if we were to believe like the young earth creationists, which I know Christian isn't, we would have to really look at like dinosaurs would be mixed in, and we'd be talking about very, very young rocks, which we're not. This is an example of what we call a lahar deposit. A lahar is a flood, sort of in a debris flow that comes off a volcano. The volcano melts the ice and it goes rushing down the river and picks up all this debris. They're incredibly destructive, but that's a flood deposit just on a small local scale from a volcanic eruption. Okay, so that's the sort of thing we should be seeing, and we don't really have evidence for it. That's another one. I couldn't find where that one was from. I suspect it's the same event from that volcano in the background. But that's the sort of thing we should be able to see in those recent sediments and rock records, depending on how far we go back. A flood is a higher energy event. Okay, so there's a lot of extra energy in the flood waters as they're moving, and as it gradually dies off, the energy leaves the system. So we get layers. We get very clear layers. We get what we call graded bedding. You can see in the bottom of the photo here. Oops, sorry. Same sort of thing there. Coarser stuff where there was higher energy, and as that energy dies off, we get finer and finer grained rocks as we go up. There's a bigger version on the right hand side of that one. And that's my favourite wedding photo that my wife and I have. It's not so much because of this. It's over here. There's a great example of graded bedding in this rock. So I use this one in my geology lessons with kids. That stuff should be everywhere around the world in sediments or rocks of the same age, and we just don't see it. The Younger Dryas, how much time have I got there, Buff?
All right, so I guess we're moving on to a rebuttal by Christian Anna.
Okay, I'll stop that sharing. I believe has that stopped?
Yep, that's all good.
Excellent.
You can start speaking.
Well, hey, just real quick, is this a rebuttal like a set period of time, or is this like a conversational back and forth?
It's up to you guys.
Oh,
What's
yeah. I just mentioned like a quick one if you wanted to mention anything specific, but we could just move into the open discussion if you like. I don't mind.
Yeah, open discussion seems good to me.
Cool. Anything you'd like to jump in with to start with?
So you mentioned before, right, that is something that stuck in my head, the fossil record. Now I'm gonna have to, when it comes to the geology and all that sort of stuff, this is like definitely not my wheelhouse. I wasn't actually able to see your screen as it was being cast. It kept trying
Oh,
to load, but it doesn't matter.
sorry.
I'll try and keep up with that stuff as best I can. You mentioned that one of the things we have evidence for is like fossils, like the same land animal in multiple different
Mm,
continents, right? And that's how we know that all the continents were together at one point, right?
yeah.
Um, could you say that there's a sort of similar thing we could do with like flood myth narratives, where it's like, across different continents, you have all these flood myths, not just that a flood happened, but with very strong narrative similarities. The kind of similarities you would expect if they were drawing on a similar cultural source, right? To the point
Mm,
where, for example, when it comes to the Epic and Gilgamesh and the Bible, um, they are like pretty much everybody acknowledges they are extraordinarily similar, to the point where they think, well, the Bible just copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, or just added details
Yeah.
to it. Which, of course, there's no real evidence of that, because it seems to, like, from what I could tell, there was a different source because of the Akkadian loanwords or something. Anyway, um, but basically what I'm saying is, like, similar to how you have like fossils in, say, um, West Africa, and then like Eastern South America, or something like along those kinds of lines, right? You have all
Mm.
these fossils, but you have a similar sort of thing going on with these flood myths. Do you think that there's I guess, a connection there?
Yeah, so like I would probably lean on the side of, like I said, I can't say it's impossible, but that maybe that they were talking about a regional flood in that area that happened sometime before the time. There's another one I found too, um, a Babylonian myth that uses a different character for the Noah Gilgamesh character as well. So there's definitely in that region stories about a flood that have great similarities to them. Um, but then, like, I think what we'd be talking about is a localized flood that was massive to the people there. But if you're in the middle of a flood, as we often have here in Australia, um, it looks like everything everywhere is flooded. You know, they would have no way of knowing that the entire world was flooded. Um, the people that wrote these books. So so I would
Well,
concede that perhaps there was a
there's
localized flood.
some
I think that
music.
changes the. Sorry?
Uh, something's. Is that me? Sorry, was that me? All I heard
I
was
couldn't
just a
hear
bunch of
anything.
music just blaring out. Sorry. Somebody. Was that? Sorry.
What kind of
Yeah,
Nobody
I
music
else.
didn't
was
hear
it?
anything.
Was it like
I don't
elevator
know. It was,
music?
no, it was
Is
just
it
like
good?
someone strumming on like a little guitar, and then a lady talking.
Oh,
Anyway. Oh, sorry about that. And moving on. Um.
that's fine. So
Um.
yeah, a localized flood, I would think would be a reason that I would suggest that those three myths in that one area happened. As for ones around the world, like flooding happens all around the world. It's not a surprise that you would hear flood stories in most
Well,
cultures around the world.
Well, to be fair with that, right? There's two things that I would like to say about that. One is that a localized flood is not out of the question for what the Bible's actually referring to. Again, like, one of the tricky things is that, from my memory, if I might be wrong about this, but from what I remember, the Hebrew word for earth or world is the same Hebrew word for land. So, um, like, when somebody wants to say, and the message will go throughout all the land. That's the same word that they would use throughout the whole world, right? And that's, pretty reasonable when you consider that, these are societies that haven't, got a global connected sort of thing. So pretty
That's
much where
right.
your territory is the whole world, for all intents and purposes, right?
Yeah.
Linguistically,
Do
right?
you, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to ask, do you not think though that that changes the narrative and the meaning behind it? Like, if we're looking at the whole world being wiped out because of how evil humankind is, I know you said not to take the Bible literally necessarily, but that has a huger message than just our little patch of the world getting flooded. That
Well,
would seem to me like they were just trying to explain a natural event that occurred and put agency to why it happened, rather than everything everywhere being wiped out and starting again. Different story.
well, I still think that's if you want to talk about theologically the message, it still speaks
Mm.
to the condition of humanity. That's uh I think that if this was just a local thing, I still think it still reflects human nature, that we tend to just progress towards wanting to kill each other, sort of thing. Like, I think that still holds. But in terms of the
Sure.
actual descriptive narrative of what's going on here, like I mentioned before, the word world and land are the same thing. So it's like, did it flood the whole world, or did it flood just the land?
Yeah.
Um, another issue is when it says that the ark came to rest on the top of Mount Ararat. Many scholars have concluded that what's translated as Mount Ararat may have been referring to the mountains of Aratu, which are a bit further
Mm.
south, for example. Um, and I believe they're a smaller mountain range. I'm not sure. Um, but it like that does like sort of impact how you're going to think of like oh well, if a flood waters covered the entirety of all the mountains and everything, that would
Mhm.
have to be a worldwide flood. Well, maybe, but like which mountains were they covering, kind of thing. It's not exactly easy, especially when the Bible, when it's talking about uh like cataclysmic events, it does tend towards a pattern of using that absolutist language, like I mentioned before, where like in one breath the Bible's saying all the trees are going to be destroyed by this hail, and then the next plague is whatever's left is going to be destroyed by the locusts, and it's like, okay, well, and it
So
does
there was
sound
nothing left.
yeah. So it's like, because it even says, like in the verse that I read, there's nothing left of all the trees. And it's like, oh, okay, but then, you know, and it sounds weird to us, but I think that's from what we read about in other literature, where it's like in the surrounding cultures at the time, it was actually a pretty common thing to use such very dramatic, in the same
Mm.
way that if you and I in the modern day are talking about a football game, and we're saying, "Oh, those guys got completely destroyed. They're utterly annihilated." We obviously understand that we're not being literal, but somebody who's not living in our
Hyperbole.
timeline, yeah, it's hyperbole, yeah. Um, and I think that I know it sort of lowers the bar a little bit, but I think at the bare minimum we do have to establish at the very least a local flood. And
Right,
not just the local flood, but like a pretty sudden. And so I'm not just like saying, oh, a flood happened at some point, kind of thing, because
right.
at this point would have reduced the claim down to basically nothing. Um,
Right, and the other thing there is that those floods happen naturally. So we kind of lose the need for the intervention of God in that. Do you know what I mean? Like, because floods of that scale do actually happen all over the world at different times. Um, that's
well,
not
that
so amazing.
Well, that just sort of presupposes this idea that God must necessarily work through non-natural means. Like for me personally, I don't make this distinction between natural and non-natural. I just think that whatever's happening is happening. For
Agree.
example, if it's been like for thousands of years, right? Ghosts have just been a known thing, that it would be like a normal thing for a ghost to just pass through my room as I'm talking right now. In that parallel universe, we wouldn't call that supernatural. We would just call that,
Just
oh yeah,
natural.
yeah, it'd be natural, right? So it's like it's kind of a arbitrary distinction. Like when it says, for example, the fountains of the deep opened up, you know, it sounds like it sounds like all God did was cause a more or less a natural process to happen, kind of. Now, when it says there's a portal that opened up in the heavens that caused it to rain, it's kind of hard to know what that's referring to, because that language, like when we say portal, you're probably thinking of like, the game portal, where like there's just like a circle just floating there in space with just like, yeah, stuff coming out of it. But that's not necessarily what that, again, because obviously those kinds of science fiction ideas didn't exist back then, right? So it's like,
Mm.
what the hell does it mean? Like, we're doing our best to translate what the hell they were talking about when they said portal. It's kind of hard to know what they meant.
Right,
um
but like, don't you think like are we reducing God in that context to the point where we don't actually need him because natural like floods happen anyway?
mm,
Like
no.
we've gone from like a story that requires God for it to be true, a global flood, to one where now we're just talking about, well, this could have just happened without God, but we've inserted God into the story with
Well,
no
I don't know.
necessary relationship.
I don't think the purpose of the flood narrative was to invoke, like some sort of explanation. Like that's the thing. We're sort of approaching it like, somebody went up to these people and asked the Hebrews, "Why did this flood happen?" And they'd be like, "Ah, because God." Like that's not necessarily um what's happening, because even in Hebrew culture and stuff like that, floods do happen without people them saying, oh, God necessarily hates us and did this to punish us. Like, especially if you read the book of Job, disasters happen all the time and God's not necessarily causing it. Or book of
But
Job might not be I meant to say book of Ecclesiastes, not book of Job. But anyway, um, very similar. Sorry. Um, anyway, so with this, like it's not so much that the story is trying to say that like I guess, like, if you look at it from the perspective of the Bible, or from a theistic perspective, things happen that God causes that could have happened without God all the time, right? God sends, Moses to preach about the you know, certain, you know, Moses showing up in Egypt and preaching about all this stuff, right? Now you could say, oh, um, why do we need? Sorry, that's a bad example. Let me think of another one. Um, let's say that you're talking about the story of Abraham going to sacrifice his son, right? Abraham's about to sacrifice his son on the altar. Angel shows up and stops him, says, "No, don't do that. That's messed up." And then, everyone goes home, I guess. Now that's a story, right? Where you don't necessarily need God to exist in order for that story to still have all happened, right? You could say, well, maybe what really happened is Abraham was going to sacrifice his son and just thought to himself, better not, and just went home, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's like, yeah, but the point of that story with Abraham, for example, was not to say, see, now that would never have happened if it wasn't for God. Abraham would have killed his son if God didn't. Like, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is more to be about, because the Bible's not really, it doesn't really seem interested in, like, so much proving God exists, so much as just describing what he does and the condition of man. That seems to be the main thing. The Bible's not saying, oh, and here's all these events that are arguments. The Bible's not putting forward arguments. That's not like what the point of the literature is, if that makes sense.
Right. But I feel like you've reduced God in this story to, like, take it or leave it. Like, it is not required for the story to be true or not. And I think, like, that sort of God is easier to disbelieve in. It's sort of like akin to what a Roman God, or like they had fire, and so they put a God in the fire. They had like natural disasters, and they were all caused by gods. Like, rather than saying like God is a necessary condition for this story, like you've just sort of said, Abraham could have been nuts. He could have just went up there to kill his son and thought that he was sacrificing him to a god. There's no need for that God to be true,
Well, if
for
you
that
want
event
to
to.
try to make the flood narrative impressive to the point where maybe there had to have been some sort of divine intervention kind of thing. If we look again at the fountains of the deep, right? No person at the time would have had the technology or the knowledge or any means that would have been necessary to know about the underground oceans, right? Like, there's no way that you got somebody like an Israelite back then, analyzing ringwoodite and looking at it under a microscope to analyze it and be like, oh, this must mean that there's a giant underground ocean kind of thing, right? With the
Right,
whole
but we've
idea of,
come to that now through scientific investigation, and you're sort of retrofitting that to fit the story that already existed. It doesn't mean that it's evidence that that story happened. You're going, oh, this
I,
evidence could support a story I already have.
I don't see how coming to that through scientific investigation, mind you, thousands of years later, actually hurts my
Mm.
point. That the fact that we verified it through science is kind of impressive, right? Like, people are always
Yeah, but
asking,
it
well, what's
doesn't
something?
doesn't have
Well,
to relate to the point either. It just could be a coincidence that there is water there that we didn't know about before, and they didn't know about when they told the story. So maybe they're not talking about it.
Well, so you're telling me, right, that a fundamental part of Hebrews, like the Israelite cosmology, right, where there's,
Mm.
like, because they didn't believe in so much of a fiery hell, and to be honest, neither do I. In the same way, like, when you picture hell, you probably imagine like all the lava underground and like Satan's got there with a pitchfork and all that. I don't think that that's like true, and neither would any of the Hebrews back then. They would have believed in
Right.
something called Sheol, which is like this underground watery place, right? That's what they believed in. Now, you've got all these cultures around the world, all these different religions making claims and things like that. That maybe that the universe all sits upon a bunch of tortoises or something, and it's just turtles all the way down. Um,
Love that.
or it's like, because I think that's actually one. I think that's the is that the Norse creation story? I can't remember. Was it Norse or
Not sure.
no? Yeah, I can't
I
remember.
could
There
be.
was one of them. One of them
Yeah,
has the
definitely.
infinite turtles.
Turtles
Um,
and the elephants, and yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've got all these different cultures, and you see one of them actually got it correct that there was actually an underground body of water. I don't think that like it seems extraordinarily unlikely you get that right by just lucky guessing. Like, how many people, when they think of underground, they think underground body of water, like, especially because it doesn't seem like you know
Well, I mean, they know that water comes from the ground. They live in a desert, so they had to find their water in the ground. Like, they know that the concept that water soaks into the ground. The water's from the deep. But all I
well,
can
I
sort of
mean,
see is that they have a primitive understanding of the world around them, and the knowledge that they have put together, they assign agency to. From the story, the way that like we're looking at it now, like I can't see that um, that was necessarily knowledge. You're saying that they got it right. I think they knew that water soaked into the ground. So again, just like they know what a flood is, it's not out of the ordinary area or the realm of possibility that they would know that some water is there. You know, they live in the desert where there's not much on the surface.
well, I mean, there's lots of aquifers and things like that
Yeah.
you know, but like I think that's a bit different to when they say like deep within the earth there's like this a bunch of water and sort of stuff, and like the idea that it would I guess like because the thing is, right, like I'm trying to Google this while I'm saying this, sorry, so if I sound
Yeah.
a bit distracted. um
All good.
I'll try and look at it later actually, but what I was trying to Google was because I tried to think about the other surrounding religions like the Canaanite religion and like the Mesopotamians and all that sort of stuff. I don't think they had a Sheol. Neither do I don't think anybody else did either.
Mm.
I'm trying to rack my brain to think about it. I don't think that in any of the world religions existing at the time or even any time after was there like this idea that there's the deep, this deep underground. Like you have like for example Hades in Greek mythology, but none of the levels of Hades or Elysium or whatever, none of them involve like this underground water. There's
Right.
underground darkness or like a dark land or something. I can't remember if it's in Greek. Um,
Don't you
and
feel like all religions do this though? Like I've heard on here quite a bit from our Muslim brothers and sisters. They talk about, oh, see, that's what the Quran was saying, and they go back and they get a passage and they make it fit what we know about the world today. Well, maybe it's not necessarily what the person that wrote it down was referring to. We have no real way of verifying that they had knowledge of that aspect of the world that we're only rediscovering now. Like, but it's a common sort of religious argument to go, look, we got that right. But did you get it right, or is it just a coincidence that you said some water come up from the ground? Like, we can't really verify that.
well, you're right that we can't exactly go back and ask the authors, what did you mean by that kind of thing. Um,
How do we know what
but
to trust
right,
in
but
the
when we're
Bible
talking
and the
about
Quran?
when we're talking about probabilistic, we don't know either way kind of problems like this, you
Mm-hmm.
kind of can't really jump to coincidence because coincidence could be used to explain any theory, really. Like, I mean, it's an alternative that we absolutely do have to consider coincidence, but it's not like that in and of itself can just uh um like explain away like all I'm trying to say is that and remember like I'm not even definitively saying that like well, I mean, I guess I am kind of saying that, but like the reason why I'm bringing this up in the first place was because you mentioned, well, this kind of reduces the need of God and all that sort of stuff. It's like, well, passing down all this knowledge and that sort of stuff, and you know, seems to be um, like I guess his role in all this. Um, it's kind of and also, the God's role in the whole thing was that because in each and every single one of these flood narratives, there's a survivor, right? Like even across continents, you've got I can't ever remember the name of the myths, but like the names that they have. But I think you've got some in Hindu, you've got some in Aztec. There's always like a survivor, and they're given moral instruction of some kind or whatever, right? Um, God's importance to the story is his relationship with man and his wanting to even if there's like a lot of messed up shit going on, he still wants to, not let us get completely fucked over by our own stupidity kind of thing. So I don't necessarily see it as like reducing God's role, like because it's kind of this weird tension where it's like you're saying, well, the Christians over here are invoking something that's supernatural, that you could only use the supernatural to explain this. And so when I try to invoke less of the supernatural to sort of get some even ground, you go, oh well, then there's no need for God. So I don't think you can really have it
Yeah.
either way. It's like, yeah,
Well,
like
I really think we can, because I can use that same argument for all of it. I would say there's no evidence for the supernatural in the world, like nothing scientific at least that we can look at,
sure
and
there is.
we've got a flood narrative that we're possibly reducing to something that we see in the world anyway, that doesn't require a god to make it happen. It could have happened without the god. Um, but they're the
Well,
same thing to me. I don't think I'm trying to hedge my bets. That's the
the
same
thing
sort of
is,
situation. I think we could remove God from this story altogether and still have a flood where everyone but one dude and his boat was wiped out.
I mean, you could, but you got to remember the debate we're having is not so much is God necessary for the flood, but did the flood happen? And
No, no,
what's the
no.
evidence
But
around that? But well, like
okay, so yeah,
to sort of address that point, because I think it's a good point to bring up, right? I'm just acknowledging it's a bit of a departure, but like in terms of you said necessity of God and all that stuff, you said that the supernatural has been there's no evidence for the supernatural in science at all, right? Well,
mm,
depending on how you want to define supernatural, now I
and
want to make it
science.
clear.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, well, I want to make it clear that I think the term supernatural, again, is a completely arbitrary category. So I don't think it can prove the supernatural either, simply because I think the term supernatural is meaningless. But if I wanted to
Right.
go by what people tend to refer to as supernatural, I could say that quantum mechanics is supernatural, right? I mean, if we think about the definition of supernatural being it goes against naturalistic sort of mechanical sort of laws of the universe,
Mm.
and it's well, actually, what, I'll let for I think I should ask you, Crux, what your definition of supernatural actually is, and we'll go with that.
Things that occur that are outside of nature, right? Outside of natural processes. If, like what you're saying, I would agree with. If God came down to Earth and we had scientific footage of him landing and going, "Hey, I'm God," and all of that sort of thing, that would just be part of the natural. He would be part of the natural world. But we don't have that. So supernatural refers to those things that we don't have the physical evidence for. In the same way that when we talk about medicine and alternative medicine, as soon as we know that it works, it just becomes medicine. You don't need an
Well,
alternative.
that's the thing that then by that definition, I don't want to be too anal about the definition, because like when people talk about the supernatural, they give very intuitive definitions. But when I try to explore the finer details of it, it tends to break apart because I don't want to sound like a smart ass, or so. But I want to let me try and like test
We
some of
are
my definitions
Australians,
that
so whatever.
oh well, there you go, yeah. Um,
Jump in.
oh, by the way, I've got to quickly switch over to my phone real quick. I'm gonna cut out. Um, give me 1 second and I'll return. Oh, I will return. Give me 2 seconds.
Right. Hoping he comes back. It's not. I guess just while we're waiting, with the point that yes, the debate is about the historical validity. I think if we're using the Bible as our sources, then we are talking about um, like a supernatural sort of narrative. So like that's why I've put sort of the position of God on the table with that aspect of it, because it is part of the story. If we're talking about that being historically valid, then we have to look at that too. Is there evidence for that aspect of it? Did I see him just pop up? No.
Yeah, I just clicked on the invite to speak, so he should come up any second now.
Okay. Oh, there he is. Yep. Hey, you welcome back. Is he working? Is he? Can't hear you, Christian.
I'm interested to see the physics behind the ringwoodite. That's interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that aspect of it. All I really found, like, I only had a quick look for the water, subsurface water, which we've always sort of known is there. Here he
Hello.
is. Hey, back. Cool. I was just saying while you're out, like the reason I put the God aspect of it on the table when we're talking about history is
Can you hear me?
is because
Hello.
yeah. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Hello. Can you hear us? No, can't hear us.
Hello.
Hey,
Can you hear me?
Christian, can you hear
we
us?
can hear
Hey,
you.
how are you? All right.
Can you hear
So
us?
with what we were talking about before. Oh, hang on. Just give me 1 second. I might have to. How do I mute on? What's up? What's up? Okay. Yeah. Right.
Did you want me
Alright.
to mute you for a sec? All right. I'm just wondering if I should read some Q&As for the time being,
If there's anything for me specifically,
or is it too early to read a couple?
you can read a few that are for me while we're waiting. If there's anything there. I was going to get into the younger, drier stuff, but like we didn't get there yet. But we'll see how we go. Is there anything there? Imagine they're mostly for him.
All right, perfect. Okay, let's see here. So this one's for Christian. Okay, skip that.
He's back. Come up again.
The problem is a lot of these are for Christian right away.
I think he's trying to come back up. Can you bring him up?
Okay,
Oh,
there we
Can
go.
you hear us? Can you
Yeah,
hear
I can
us?
hear you. Yep.
Sweet.
Yeah, I can
Right.
hear you. Yep.
Right. Cool.
Alrighty. So we were talking about the supernatural before.
Mhm.
So you defined the supernatural as being anything that we don't have like that kind of physical evidence for, and anything that goes outside of nature, right? Well, because depending on like if that's like I guess the full definition, right? You could say that literally anything that's put forward by theoretical physicists would itself be supernatural categorically. And I'm sure that they would all disagree with you because they're trying to describe how the natural world works, which again they haven't got evidence for yet. But based on that definition, any string theory would be supernatural, quantum gravity would be supernatural. All of these kinds of scientific theories would be supernatural by that definition, right?
No, there, there is theoretical science that they're trying to. He's gone again. Theoretical science that they're trying to prove to find the evidence or to explain the evidence that they have for reality that's still talking about the natural world. They just don't know how that's operating at this stage. It's still there. Sorry, did you hear me then, or
Yeah,
when you
I
dropped
can hear
down?
you.
Yeah,
I don't even know why I dropped out. Sorry.
that's right. Um, yeah, like that's still a description of science. It's just science that we're currently investigating. It's not talking about something outside the natural realm.
Well, based on the way you seem to have defined it, nothing by definition could exist outside the natural realm. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
confused what you mean. It's almost like you're just sort of saying everything that exists is everything that exists. Like I don't.
Well, I guess I pretty much am because I don't think that there's necessarily anything outside of that natural order. But that's why we had the term supernatural, as in it is above or outside the natural system.
Yeah, but then it becomes sort of unfalsifiable to say that the supernatural can't exist because you're defining the supernatural as that which doesn't exist. Something.
How would you
You
define
know,
it?
well, that's the thing. I wouldn't. I think that the supernatural is like it's a useless term. I don't believe
Right.
that natural are meaningful terms. Now, if you said like maybe physical and non-physical, maybe that's a bit more meaningful. Or maybe you could say, like for example, let's take, the soul. Is the soul supernatural? You know, I would say that's what people tend to refer to when they say supernatural. But if it's just a natural part of our world, right, then there's no reason to call it, you know, supernatural. So I guess like it so when you say that we like don't have any evidence for the supernatural, it's like, well, yeah, by definition, like it. I guess
Yeah, no, I
I'm
know
gonna
what you're
ask.
saying. There is a problem with that, except I don't think that you're giving me examples of things that would contradict that, because I would say the soul is a supernatural concept. It's not something we have any evidence for in reality.
Well, that depends entirely on what you mean by soul. Some people, when they refer to soul, they just mean your experience or your consciousness. We have
Yeah, but
evidence
then
for
we're
the
just are we
consciousness.
just playing with definitions at this point? Like when
Well,
we
that's.
both agree with the supernatural thing, like you were sort of agreeing with it,
I mean,
like
I,
any of that
I'm
being
just,
part
I'm
of
kind of
nature.
concerned, right? I'm kind of concerned that you're trying to place what I'm claiming. You're placing that
Mm.
in the category of supernatural, and then taking that category of supernatural and just dismissing it categorically. Um, you're not doing this as bad as like some other people might, because you still are weighing up the evidence for it. But some people would even like say that, oh, if something's supernatural, then it doesn't matter how much evidence you have for it, you could never prove it, kind of thing. You just dismiss it outright, kind of thing, right? But
Well, there's definitely there are things in our world and in our history and religion that um, are things that are not accountable by scientific means. So we have to sort of label those things somehow. Um, there are ideas that are more abstract that don't fit into the scientific method, and they exist. Like we look at things like art and law and things that might not be art's not a good term, but like law and things that don't that sort of exist outside of maybe the scientific method or that evidence that we want, or observation, like things we can actually observe that people believe in, or that are an aspect of the world. And again, like it does come down to what you say, that it's if that's unfalsifiable, then I can't do anything about that. I can't help one way or the other with that. If I don't have any physical evidence for it and I can't disprove it, then until that evidence comes to light, I'll just put it in that category of something that I can't. Like if we don't need God for this flood, then it could have just been a flood.
okay,
Yeah,
but like it seems to be that like when you're saying, oh, we don't have any evidence for it. Well, in terms of there being a flood, I like a pretty cataclysmic
maybe there
flood.
was a flood. Yeah,
Yeah, but like I'm thinking more like, when I say local, I I'm not just claiming, uh,
just
it's
around
kind of hard to.
Jerusalem. Yeah, it could have been massive. Yeah, but
Yeah.
then perhaps there is evidence for, like, because there are multiple narratives now. Either the narratives have just influenced each other, or they are referring to a historical event that happened in that case. But that doesn't mean that the flood narrative in the Bible is the way that happened, and that God was required and present as part of that process. I think that does change the historical validity of the flood narrative. It's all part of that story. It could have
Mm,
just been a description of a natural event.
Again, like it being a description of a natural event, like that's the issue. Like you keep saying it's just a natural event, and I'm saying I'm not necessarily disagreeing. And then like, like I guess I keep getting hung up on that word natural. That this idea of there being
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
like.
I'm just using that to suggest, like, it could have occurred without the God aspect of it, without an intervention from a deity. And they could have just explained it away as, oh, everything was, yeah, like God was punishing us for the way we were living. But that could
Well, that
just be people making up that story, like you said with Abraham on the mountain. Maybe it had nothing to do with an angel and with God telling him to do it. Maybe he was just nuts. And they
well
went, oh, write that down. Yeah, I know.
The thing is that it doesn't seem to be a problem for either of our sort of arguments here. Like the idea that it could have happened without a god, it's like, well, yeah, basically anything that occurs in the universe with a god could conceptually, metaphysically happen in like an alternative universe where there's no gods. Like
Yeah.
similar things could happen. Like that, but that doesn't like you know. If I see like a pen in my room start floating or something, and I think, oh, maybe that's God doing that. There's an alternative universe where like maybe it's just a magic pen or something. But that doesn't mean that just because it's a possible alternative, like again, that doesn't seem to be what we were originally debating. What we were originally debating was, did Noah's flood really happen, kind of thing.
The validity of that historical
Yeah,
narrative, which includes the presence of God, right? That's
yeah, right.
part of the story.
Well, I
Yeah, I
mean,
can see that it could be based on a real event, but that the validity of the narrative, that's what would be called into question then. That the narrative might have just been a story made to describe something natural, not as it was written. I think, yeah,
I mean,
it's
I think this might be like what I'm about to suggest might go a bit beyond the scope of the debate, but I could, I guess, provide arguments for God's existence. I know that's like an entirely different debate, but I'm, I guess, happy to do that.
yeah,
Like,
it would be a different debate. But I think if you're going into the whole validity of that text, then that is part of it. And I think you've kind of not reduced, or you haven't addressed that, but you have provided a scenario that doesn't require God,
well,
which
because
does bring that narrative into question.
I mean, I never claimed for it to require God. Like, so for example, like whether or not God exists, like that's a discussion I'm like pretty happy to have. And like, if I could just provide you, maybe with some pretty damn good philosophical arguments or whatever for God's existence, and then like have that sort of sorted out, then that like those arguments would be in support of the historical narrative, right? But I mean, just for the sake of this debate, I decided to focus more on the parts of the narrative, like for example, the fountains of the deep. That's a part of the historical narrative. I decided to focus on its use of language. Is it talking about a worldwide flood or is it more local? It's kind of hard to tell. I decided to look at the period that it might have taken place in, the Younger Dryas. Um, I looked at the evidence of the surrounding flood myths and the similarities between them. And so the historical evidence is there. Like there's stuff backed up. If you want to sort of move to like other issues of, well, yes, but all of that requires a God. Well, then I'm happy to
No, no,
have the
no.
God conversation. But
Yeah, no. The reason I brought that up is those things that you're mentioning are part of the validity of that narrative. They are talking about whether the version in the Bible is real or not. Now, if you want to reduce it to, it says that it was like a worldwide flood, but we're acknowledging that they may have just meant land, and we're reducing that story. And I'll concede that maybe it was based on a real flood that happened, but then there's nothing special about that story anymore. Like you've stripped away all of the stuff that is important to that narrative by saying we don't have to take it literally. It wasn't global. It could have happened by any other means and just been an inspiration for this story. And then I concede that that could have happened, but there's no necessary condition that it did happen. And we've reduced God's role in it to just being a possibly unnecessary character. But
well, I don't
um,
think I've reduced God's role in anything. Like, I just think that's
by
you know,
reducing the text from as it's originally written, or as we have an example of it now, to what um, to a possibility of a flood that could occur anywhere. That any like if I have a flood right here now, and any of my neighbours could say God did that, and they were wiping us out um, for being bad or not looking after the neighbourhood or whatever. But there's no basis that that is actually what's happened. So that's why I went down that track.
I guess I do want to clarify something when I say that like maybe I should talk about the scale that I think the flood might have happened, right? I think
Okay.
that a majority of the world was probably experiencing, like an overwhelming majority of the world is experiencing some sort of flooding. That's what I do think happened. So like it's not just like, oh, just happening in Israel. I do think that we would that it did sort of happen. Like again, you see this kind of flood narrative show up across cultures. So I'm thinking it probably happened pretty much wherever you see those cultures. I'm imagining there's a flood that happened, right?
A
And so you
flood,
see these
right?
cultures, yeah, like a
Not
single flood that
necessarily
happened.
the flood. Is there
Well,
evidence that all of those things are referring to one narrative? We have floods around the world at different times. It's
yeah,
not
like at different times, but I think it's possible that there was one really huge flood that got most of the world, um, and inspired those narratives, right? Like, because especially because we do tend to see that these floods, again, we can't exactly trace back the exact origin of when they started or anything, but they do
yeah.
seem to go about around about the Younger Dryas period. That does seem to be where it's pointing to, right? And
What's that based on?
based on,
The
I guess, like how far we can trace back the narratives, first of all. Um, second of all, the similarities between the narrative elements. The fact that they're all so very similar seems to be that there's a connection between them. And
there's
also,
three from that area. What? Yeah. Are you
what's that?
suggesting that people in South America, if they had a story about a flood and there was a survivor, that they were referring to Noah, who was half the world away?
Well,
Because you
no, I don't.
said that those myths have a survivor in them, wherever they are. Are we to
I
say that, like the ones that are from that region, the Babylonian ones, I would agree that could be based on the same story, but right around the world, I don't see why we'd have to assume that they're all talking about the one time, one flood.
well, I don't think it was all referring to Noah necessarily. I think there could have been like multiple survivors kind of deal. But like, because especially in some of the flood narratives, there's like multiple dudes. Like, oh, I guess there was in a biblical flood narrative as well, but it doesn't matter. Um, like, you have there's one flood myth where there's like a dude who um marries like a giant woman or something, and like they try to survive the flood. Um, I think they do. I can't remember. Um, uh, and you also have like basically the commonalities between the narratives is the like there was a flood. It's something to do with very pissed off gods. It had something to do with gods being pissed off specifically at human behavior of some kind. Um, there was a group of survivors who tried to warn people or something along those lines. Um, they didn't always build a boat. Sometimes they would try to build temples that were really high or something like that. Um, and then the idea is that not that these survivors came back, and the extra element is that they gave each of these survivors gave moral instructions or state building advice to like you know whoever was left. Basically, it wasn't just uh you know so like I think it's like once you see those common elements of the story, you don't just go, oh, they're all saying a flood happened. The narrative elements being similar to this degree kind of shows at least some influence over one another, like some sort of point of commonality, where it's like you know uh like with the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And the Bible, we can see that, well, these two have either influenced one another or they're drawing on a similar source, right? And then they've just,
Right.
maybe added some differences here and there, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they're
There's a.
geographically close makes that very. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say there is a third one I found. It's a Babylonian source. Sorry, I'm just pulling it up on my computer, and
There's
it
four of them, I think. There's like four
At
different.
Atrahasis, the Epic
Yeah,
of
that's the one.
Atrahasis, is an Babylonian one. The gods warn about their plans to flood the world. He builds a boat, but then in that story, the gods save him because they're hungry, and they were providing some sort of sacrifice to feed the gods. So like
Yeah,
that's a different reason for the gods saving them. Um,
yeah.
I'm just
Oh,
not
yeah.
sure if there's four in that region, then yeah, they could have been a story that one was based on an event, or that they're all based on those original sources. It does not necessarily indicate that they are all talking about one real event. And to extrapolate that the whole world, when you, like you said, it's all pervasive or omnipervasive, but you
I may
also
have been.
noted it's not really in Australia and not really in Africa. That's
Yeah.
not omnipervasive.
Well,
It's not
I
everywhere, and
used
there's no way to assume they're all at the same time.
much like the Bible, I use the term omnipervasive a bit hyperbolic. I think that we see this in a majority of places. Uh, like, or at least maybe not the myths. I don't think. Oh, kind of. But what I'm saying is the evidence for, because when I was looking at the Younger Dryas impact and all the areas that it affected, it
What's them
seemed to
up?
have
Sorry.
affected. What's that? Sorry.
I just saw a comment that he wanted to see my beautiful face, so I blew him a kiss. Sorry, carry on.
Fair enough. um, so the areas that it seemed to have affected was all along North and South America, I believe.
We're talking about the
Um,
Dryas.
yeah, the Dryas. Like the impacts, specifically, not just the period called the Younger Dryas.
Mm,
The flooding seemed to have affected South America, America, parts of a lot of Europe, um, and parts of North Africa, but not much of the rest of the continent, and bits and pieces of Asia, but not much Central Asia, and I don't think it affected Australia at all. I don't think.
no.
Um,
The evidence that I could find was only related to the North Atlantic, and it was about that current. I don't know if you've seen the day after tomorrow. Is that what it's called? Where the North Atlantic current stops. That's the reason that I could find that the Younger Dryas occurred. That current stopped, where the hot water from the equator goes up to the north, cools, and gets saltier, more salinity, and sinks back down. That circular current is how the heat's redistributed through the world, and it stopped the when the glaciers melted and the fresh water poured into the Atlantic. Um, the
that does
information
sound
that
familiar. Yeah,
yeah,
like
um,
I did come across something like that in my research, but
right.
I remember there
Did you?
being problems with it, because there's like there
There's
seems to be
problems if you want to make it fit the
well,
flood
yeah, like
narrative.
no,
Definitely
no, no, no.
problems with.
I think there was problems with like that being the explanation for the Younger Dryas impacts, like that it was actually just the currents that got cut off. I think it was, from what I remember, there was just more evidence of like the effects reaching different places that wouldn't have affected. I didn't like go into
Yeah,
much depth of that when I was looking at this stuff. Sorry, so I can't really comment with much confidence on that, I guess.
right. Why I'm bringing it up though is that the sources that I was able to find all suggested that it was more localized than that it was a relatively minor sea level rise at the top of a that was our sort of interglacial period after the last interglacial period, and the sea level rise was like 130 meters over that entire period, which lasted for over 1,000 years. It wasn't like I think it said 13-meter rise in the Young Dryas. That's not really
I
enough.
remember I've seen other sources talk about something similar but a lot different at the same time, where it's like in other areas, like there was pretty strong flooding in a lot of areas, but then in other areas it was more like a gradual increase over like 50 years. That I mentioned that at the start of the debate, where it's like gradually
Uh,
you see sea levels rise by like, and there would have been massive flooding in quite a lot of places, but not like covering the whole continent. Mostly like just messing up like a lot of coastal areas. That's what I seem to have remembered.
right,
Um,
and that would be not necessarily like that to then tie that to the flood narrative in the Bible. I think is a stretch because we're talking about different sort of conditions. It's not as extreme. We're talking about further back in time than the Bible says, but that doesn't matter because we're not taking the Bible literally. We're talking
well,
about a
I'm not.
time when there's not boats of that sort of size because I think the earliest boat we've got is from like 8,000 years ago or something like that. Preserved boat doesn't mean they didn't have boats, but ships of like that sort of massive scale they wouldn't have had. Yeah, I've got here the Pesce canoe is the earliest boat we've got, maybe, and they've dated it between 8,200 and 7,600 BC. That's the earliest boat that we have. And the Dryas was 11 and 12,000 years ago, like a period of 1,000 years.
Yeah,
Okay, is
12,000
that how
years.
far back we're going? Like, because that doesn't seem to.
Well, with the boat thing, this is where, again, because I do remember saying that this is definitely, this whole sort of area of debate is definitely outside my expertise kind of thing. I definitely don't know much about like the boat stuff. Like that's not what I researched coming into this.
Yeah, no, I
I
didn't either. Like, I just looked into that specific thing. I thought, well, did we have ships of a size 11,000 years ago when the dry ice happened? So
well,
I
I
did
think
look into it
that
from that aspect.
our ability to comment on that sort of stuff is very limited because like it seems like all we have is like, oh, this is like the oldest preserved boat, but that's like saying that we didn't have stories before the Epic of Gilgamesh
Yeah,
because the Epic
sure.
of Gilgamesh is the oldest story we have, kind of thing, And
It's
given
not
the
evidence that there wasn't ships of a size at the time. That's entirely
yeah,
true. But like, all we can go on from the present day is the evidence available to us. So we're trying to look at whether it's historically valid to believe that that flood narrative was accurate, and we've got to look at the evidence that we have.
right. I mean, yeah, I guess we're gonna sort of return back to that. I mean, um, yeah, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of the
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I'm just like, that's why I bring up the boat. It's not to say that there wasn't any seafaring cultures at the time. Just we don't have evidence that they existed. So to suggest that they built a boat bigger than anything we can build today of that sort of material, and
what we don't know was like again, like
sorry,
this.
yeah, we don't know what that wood is, but I'm saying from wood, if we were to build a wooden boat. One of the things I stumbled across was a guy who built a replica of the Ark, and at first I thought people said that this wasn't possible. He built it out of wood and to the scale mentioned in the Bible, depending on what a cubit is. But then it turned out he put it on these barges underneath, and they could pull it with tugboats in rivers, but it wasn't seaworthy. And it, like it twists and damages the way that we would expect a huge wooden boat to. Like the boat's a different issue, obviously, to whether or not the flood itself is possible. But like all these sort of things, like I just feel like that they do come back to that point. We can only use the evidence of reality that we have and the narrative that exists. But I don't know if we could
Well,
say
yeah,
that
like
it
to
is
sort of wrap
valid.
it all, up. Let's try to sort of go through and like compare the evidence to the pieces of information we have, right? So if we look at fountains of the deep type of thing, it says that the fountains of the deep were opened, blah blah blah. We have recently discovered underground oceans. And by the way, like the fact that this is a recent discovery, by the way, that like if we were having this conversation, let's say 4 years ago, the idea of an underground ocean, I would be laughed off the stage, kind of thing. Like it would have been a completely ridiculous idea. But the fact that
Well,
we're constantly wouldn't it?
I,
I'm pretty sure.
no,
Pretty
like
sure that was the,
we've known about groundwater for a long time. If you're talking about an ocean in the rocks, like in porous material, where I am here in Newcastle, the water table's right under the sand dunes, and there's places that just flood with the smallest amount of rain. It just comes up like there is groundwater, and we've tapped into that for a long time. We know that it's there, but the extent to which it was there, maybe that's the recent sort of discovery. But like, you're not talking about an ocean as in an open air cavern ocean, right? You're talking about a massive amount of water in the rock.
yeah, yeah, like it's
Yeah,
it's
groundwater.
yeah, but it's also underneath the Earth's crust kind of thing. It's not just like an aquifer sort of deal.
Could you chuck a source at me at some stage of that? I'd like to
Yeah,
look into it.
sure. I've what
Not
few
now,
sources
I
I
could
do
say that.
manage to still have on my computer. I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure I've
because
no,
that's
not that one.
very deep if you're talking about under the crust, not in the crust. The one that I gave you was the 6 quintillion like megaliters of water or whatever it is that's groundwater within the upper 1 mile of the crust.
So very specifically, it's in the transition zone. Um, so pretty damn deep below the mantle. So I'll just link that in the chat.
Yeah,
There's one source I could look for. I'm going to look for more because that was just one I found that.
that's fine. Yeah, I can go from there.
Yeah, awesome. I'm just making sure that I have another one if that one's bunk or whatever.
Oh no, I can get into that. I've had a look. All right, cool. Keep that open. I'll have a look. They may be different water than that we were talking about there, and I thought we were talking about the
Oh,
same
okay.
thing.
Oh yeah, no, like the water I'm talking about, it's in the transition zone, which is like pretty far below the mantle. Pretty like very, very, very deep in the Earth's core. Lots of ringwoodite, I think, and or I think I don't even know if it's like that the ringwoodite forms like in like a large, almost like a ball in the center of the Earth, or if it's like there's just some ringwoodite that came up with some like rare diamonds. Like that's how they discovered it. They found some diamonds with like bits of ringwoodite in it, and they did some tests. Blah blah
The
blah.
ringwoodite has water locked up in its crystal structure. It's not
Yeah,
liquid water,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I
How would that
think
have got out of there or got to
I
there? That would be the thing that I'd be.
I think there's still uh because when I was looking through my research on the ringwoodite, they were going through like how it's like part of the, it's very possibly, because again it's a recent discovery, so they're not saying too much definitive stuff, but they're saying that this is very likely part of the world's water cycle. So the water that's in the oceans, some people, I think it might have even been in the source that I linked you, or might not have. I'll try and find it for you. They're trying to say that some scientists are saying this is where the Earth's oceans came from, rather than like a meteorite. They're uh saying that it might have come from like all this ringwoodite, basically. Well, I don't know how all that got there, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of scientists are saying that this is putting forward new theories for how Earth's oceans came to be and how the Earth's water cycle works, because there seems to be again, a lot of this was like YouTube videos explaining it. So, but a lot of them were sort of saying, oh yeah, this is part of like the water cycle. This is part of like the whole system. It's not just like trapped down there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it is trapped down there
Well,
because it's
trapped,
inside
yeah,
those
trapped,
minerals.
but like
Under
like
such heat and pressure that you can't have water down there. Like it's not water. It's not liquid water. It's part of like those elements are part of the crystal structure. I think it's saying where the water come from, but yeah, I'd have to have a better look at that. I'm not familiar with that.
And I think like the when this materials get spewed up in like volcanoes and stuff like that,
Yep, water's
that's how it,
released.
yeah, part of the water cycle
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, all right. So that one, that's the water, the subsurface water, or deep from the deep,
Yep.
deep. That is very deep. You are correct.
And then yeah, so and then we have again like Younger Dryas. There is a period of history in our Earth's history where this sort of flood could have, I guess, happened, especially if it happened in conjunction with, say, a big burst of this sort of stuff entering into the system and then leaving again or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
would suggest that the Younger Dryas couldn't possibly be the biblical account of the flood, but um,
I thought you were saying that it could have before.
no, I was saying that there could have been a flood that they're referring to, but the Younger Dryas is like I'm not sure. I can't see how it fits any of your criteria for being the same event. It doesn't occur on the same time scale, but again, we've dismissed the time scale.
Well,
It doesn't flood. I don't think there's any evidence that it flooded the Middle East. And
just to clarify on the timescale thing, I don't think we because we didn't talk about that much. I don't think that's well, I guess like in terms of it quote being on the same timescale, I don't think that's uh the Bible necessarily claims it happened at a specific date or anything.
just
I
going
know
off
that
the
there's people.
genealogy in the Bible as the young Earth creationists would, you've only got a period of 6,000 years to play with, and this happened before that, 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas.
Well, a lot
So
of people
that's just
have
a time scale.
well, I guess this is where, yeah, the non-lit, because a lot of people have scholars and stuff have analyzed the genealogies. A lot of them apparently are saying that well, first of all, I can't remember where I read this, but there's like some fucky shit with the numbers where it's like it might have been more about to do with uh numerology or so, not numerology, but like the way their number system was set up, where it's like you know how we have a base 10 number system.
Yeah.
Well, they had some sort of different set of numbers, like a different base number system type of thing, where different numbers would have seemed symmetrical to them than to us. Like for example, 10, 40, 100, these would have been like very symmetrical numbers to us. Apparently, from what I've seen, the numbers that are placed in each and every single one of the years that's given for, and this person lived this long, and you've got people supposedly living for like 500 and so years or something. Apparently,
Yeah.
each and every single one of them is very symmetrical, to the point of it being like it doesn't seem literal for that reason. Like when we say,
Don't
"Oh,
you
we
feel
don't have
like
to
we're
take,"
moving the goalposts just to make the narrative fit then? Like we're saying, oh,
oh,
that's what it says, but that's not really what it means. And like then we
no,
just
no,
start
no,
shifting all the goalposts to make it still possible.
no. This
And I,
I did this. I looked into this like when like not having to do with the flood narrative thing at all. Like apparently like in terms of the symmetry of the numbers, in terms of what their base is or something like that. Um, this wasn't like in the context of like oh well this is how the flood narrative could have happened that back at this time kind of thing. Like that's not what I'm like. This was just something I've seen before where it's like the numbers are.
yeah,
Like okay, for example, when it says and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, let's say, I think they mentioned that that's just a unit of measurement. Like basically, like it said, if I was to say and it rained for about a month, let's say, um,
right,
like that usually has a certain idea of like a certain set of time. But like, or like if I was to say a legion, let's say, a legion's usually 1,000 men, but it doesn't have to be like like that literal kind of thing. And they would
right.
have had different like standards of measurements for these kinds of things.
Sure, but I just feel like it's sort of shifting the goalposts to.
Well, my goalposts were never that it happened at the 6,000 year. Like I never claimed that in this
No, no,
debate.
no. And that's why I said we weren't looking at that. If you're then trying to make the younger Dryas fit, then we have to like say that's why I'm bringing up all these things like the boats we had at the time, the amount of sea level that changed. We can see from the rocks, like I was saying before, we can see what the environment was like in a particular place and where the sea level would have been. Like you get beach deposits on a beach, so you can look at those rocks and sort of see that to get an indication. Aside from the like the data that they get from other means, I've got a graph here I was going to show, but you can't. It wouldn't pop up on your thing anyway. But it says in the last 20,000 years we've had 130 meters of sea level change, and that's over 20,000 years. Even if your flood narrative is talking about like it's not 40 days, in the space of that 40 days, we don't have that sort of
Well,
sea level change that would cover everything. Like it's not
not
in
that will cover
evidence in
everything,
the rocks.
but remember, I didn't make a claim for that necessarily, and also I
Not the
did
globe,
say that.
no, no, but I'm saying like the evidence for in the younger Dryas and for that period, the last 20,000 years, is only a sea level change of around 130 from the last glacial period where all the water was trapped up in the ice to where that's melted. It's been a gradual heating over the last 20,000 years, except for this younger Dryas period. And the sea level has only risen 130 meters in that time.
From
That's
what
that's
I
the position of
from
the
Yeah, from what
scientists.
I
Like,
remember, this is where that like I saw a bit of debate on this, and I thought because again, once I see that there's like a controversy on all that sort of stuff, again because this is my area of expertise, this is where I take a step back and go, okay, I can't
yeah,
say anything.
I
Well,
guess
I
what I'm
say
suggesting on that front though is that like you got to be careful saying like I know you only said like perhaps the younger Dryas is the flood that we're talking about, but if we'd have to look into that, and I'm saying like since you brought it up, I wasn't familiar with it, but I've had a little look, and the conditions that it's suggesting don't seem to fit with the flood narrative.
yeah, I
Like
think
it,
that comes from the controversies around whether or not the younger drought impact happened suddenly or happened gradually, and I think in either cases, you do see a lot of evidence of at the very minimum coastal flooding. That is, I think, even in the geological record that we do see then. Um,
right,
but I still think that there's still some dispute that some flash floodings did happen. But like again, this is when I saw some sources saying, oh, and this says from this record that we can tell the flash flooding uh, did occur in these areas, and then I saw something else
Right.
that said
For
something
the
else.
Middle East, for the younger dryas? Because I
Yeah, I
can't
think I
find
did.
any,
I think I
like it's a
saw
North
something.
American phenomenon.
I did see
Like it
something in the
changed.
Middle East. If I can find that, it was attached to a YouTube video. So
The stuff that I found, like,
that's
because it
where.
centers on the ice cap in like North America, like that sort of in the Arctic region up the top there. So we're talking about the North Atlantic and like flooding outwards from there. And it did change the temperature and climatic conditions over the world, but not uniformly. So it's not like we can extrapolate it from the North Atlantic to the Holy Land. You know, like that you have to have evidence that you could move it from there. And I just don't like. I haven't seen it, but I haven't been looking into it for too long. Just in preparation of
Yeah,
us talking together, because it didn't seem right.
I think maybe I do seem to remember seeing something like during this period, you do see like pretty big flooding in Israel, I think. I'm gonna after this debate, I'm gonna go hunt that down and try and link it to you if I can find it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah.
I
Just
know
look at it.
I know where I know where I found it. I just have to like it would take me a while to go back and find it, and
Yeah.
I don't want to. Yeah, but I will. Hold me to that in the DMs. I'm gonna get you that source.
Cool. Yeah, no,
All
that's
right.
good. That's the only thing. Like, I can just we've already conceded right from the outset that we can't know definitively. So all we
Mm.
can do is look at our sources, and you're right that you can say like perhaps this is the event that where it occurred, but then we would have to go and find the evidence that it does match up, and I haven't been able to find that myself. Like you obviously have seen stuff that you're happy with, suggesting it as a possibility, not saying this was it. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
like I
because
can't get past anything other than a large scale regional flooding. I could probably give you that, but like I don't know if we've got evidence for much else.
yeah, I again, this is one because like not only am I woefully out of my depth in terms of like my area of expertise kind of thing. This has been a very
Yeah,
new sort of thing for me in terms of the research that I have seen. Yeah, like I it's entirely true. Like, let's say that you and I died this second in the middle of this debate, and we go and see God, and He tells us the answer, to this debate we're having, and we goes, "Oh, it was actually it wasn't in the Younger Dryas, but it happened at 8,000 years ago, and there's
yeah.
the evidence found, blah blah blah." And we'd be like, "Oh, that kind of thing."
No,
Um,
bugger! I wish I had that for the debate.
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Um, But yeah, I reckon we can go into the question and answer stuff. And
yeah,
while
great.
we maybe Crux could go first because I just got to quickly take a call from my mother. My little brother's got a broken
Oh, it's
leg, so I
important.
just gotta.
That's important. Better do
Yeah,
that.
I'll be like 2 minutes. One sec.
All right, cool. Thanks.
So did
Good
you want
stuff.
me to ask
Yeah,
questions for Cruux?
yeah, yeah. That'd be good to start with
All right, just
if
gonna.
they're still here and interested.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So I'll start from the first question here. Okay. Um. All right. Let's see here. Is there any field of earth science that doesn't disprove the global flood?
It doesn't disprove it. I think you have to be real careful in science talking about disproving. All we can really do is look at the probability of something happening. Um, so Christian was talking about like if we reduce it to the scale of that localized area, I'd have to go into the rock and sediment record in that local area and see is there evidence of a flood in that area? Did it wipe out people? Or are we talking pre-people? Like in the Younger Dryas, we're not talking about pre-people, but I just don't think it's in that region. Um, so you have to look at the evidence in that area to find out whether there's evidence of the flood. If you're going to extrapolate it all the way over the world, I don't think I haven't seen any evidence that could be possible. Like I said when I put my slideshow up, we have evidence of intense floods like those volcanic floods that occur and wipe out towns, right? And then afterwards you can come and walk on the top of them and see like buildings sticking out over the top of the flood debris, we have those sediments. If they occurred earlier in time, then we should be able to see them. And if they're uniform across the world, there should be a spot where that stuff's still exposed, and we don't have that evidence. So is it there somewhere and we can't see it? Maybe it's underneath other stuff? I don't know. The rocks we have on the surface are much older, and they don't have any of that evidence in it. I guess that's what I'd say to that one.
That's a good answer. So that was from Tinfoil Freak. The next question I have for you is Christian Anarchy.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you're here?
Yeah, I'm here. I can answer.
Here we go. So we'll go for the first one here. Please provide evidence for a global flood at any time in history. There is some reports from every civilization dealing with flood at at some point in history, but this isn't evidence of one great flood, but rather local floods that we see today. So that was pretty early on. I think you answered that before, so I'm just going to check that off the list. Okay, let's see here. Why did Japan not record any flood? Why does the archaeological evidence not show Egyptian civilization destroyed by the flood? That was by Mark Reed.
With the Japan thing, that was one of the areas that I was saying didn't get affected by the flood, which is ironic because they're always flooding. As you think the one place, right?
They do have flood stories, yeah, just not. Well, I
They
mean, obviously because they've got tsunami
Yeah, well, they
floods,
got
but
floods
yeah,
every 5 minutes, so they've got plenty
yeah,
of flood stories. But um, with the Japan area was not affected by the Younger Dryas at all. I don't think. Well, there might have been some sea level rise, but that's about it. Like that, they
yeah.
didn't really face a lot of that. So that's not. As for the Egyptian record, I'd say I would dispute that there was no evidence of flooding. I do know that there was a
Yeah.
flood myth to go along with it, because there was a flood myth, and this is one of the few ones I did read up on, where it's like, apparently there was this goddess who was going mad, and she turned some of the oceans to blood or something, and then some guy made a boat and like tried to drain the water of all the blood, and then that's how they have this wine festival. There was an ancient wine festival that every time the Nile would flood every year, they would drink wine, and that's their flood narrative was part of that. So there was a great flood narrative for Egypt. And as for the archaeological evidence that there was flooding, there's always flooding in Egypt. Like Egypt also floods all the time, or at least used to. That's like um that's like saying, well, did Japan flood? Like they flood pretty often. So the idea that there was no flooding in ancient Egypt, I would probably dispute that, especially if I can find that source about
I
the
think
flooding.
he's more referring to like nobody would dispute floods in Japan and Egypt. We're referring to evidence of that scale of a flood, like pyramids underwater sort of flood, not the Nile flooding because it flooded all the time. Like you said, it was a yearly event. They relied on that to survive because that was all their farmlands were either side of the floodwaters on the floodplain. But there's no evidence that all of their civilization went underwater around that time, and that civilization has evidence back further than again the biblical narrative would suggest. So that's interesting if they didn't see it, and they are so close regionally compared to Japan and the Younger Dryas stuff in North America. They would be closer to experience a similar large scale flood, I guess.
I would have to look at the source I mentioned before to you, Crux, to see if there was flooding around Egypt at that time. From what I can tell, the water seems to have come in. If I could try to find it, from what I remember, it seems to come in as sort of like a gulf somewhere where it's like it goes from. I'm trying to remember that diagram I saw on that source where it's like it goes from in the middle there, and yeah, it's possible Egypt might not have been affected, I guess, but I would, I guess, dispute that. I would have to check my source that I don't have
Yeah,
right now. Very sorry, that's very sloppy of me. Um,
that's all right.
but
Well, I mean, these are questions, so they're things that we haven't considered in our
yeah,
presentation.
I'll definitely have a look at Egypt, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so maybe I'll just move on to I'm just going through these chronologically. So like the next one on the list was by Dogs Are Dogs. Younger Dryas was about 12,000 years ago. What evidence is there that this flood correlates to the time of Noah's flood, which was presumed to be 5,000 years ago?
So this
I think
kind
we
of
sort
comes
of
back to
covered that.
that timeline thing where it's like I don't think that Noah's flood is necessarily or like fundamentally it's fundamentally. I don't think it's fundamentally necessary to view Noah's flood as happening 5,000 years ago. I would dispute that. I guess. So we kind of already discussed that. Yeah.
All right. Let's see here. By Mark Reed, why does the Bible say everything living on the face of the earth was wiped out, people and the animals and the creatures that move along the ground, and the birds were wiped from the earth? A local flood would not kill all the birds. Why does it say this?
So that's where I covered that in the Exodus thing, where it basically says the exact same thing. If you'll remember at the start of the debate, you might not have been there for that, so I'll just
He
read that
was.
out. Oh, he was. Where
Yeah,
it's
no, I
throughout the
was
land of.
here. Just one thing I want to point out is I'm reading these out chronologically, so they.
Oh no, not you. I meant Mark Reed. Mark Reed might not have been there for when I dealt with that sort of thing. So to answer that question, uh, like if I look at Exodus, it says, throughout the land of Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. And then the next plague is all the greenery getting eaten up. So we do see this like a narrative sort of theme where narratively very omnipervasive language in hyperbolic language, especially when it's talking about cataclysmic events, does seem to be used. And then the Bible will seemingly, not always obviously, but you know, got like apparently this kind of use of language would have been more clear to the audience that it was being written to, which is all I can say about that. But yeah, that kind of omnipervasive language does certainly paint a picture of a worldwide flood, and it certainly, like if I was arguing with somebody saying, no, it absolutely was a worldwide flood, look what it says. It's like, well, yeah, that's convincing evidence. That the Bible's talking about a worldwide flood, but at the same time, we have evidence to the contrary. So it's just a matter of weighing that up.
All right. And Mark responded in chat, and he basically said that he may have been cooking at that
You've
time.
been cooking.
Uh, fair enough.
Yeah.
So the next one is by DJ Batman, and he said, "Cruux, why are you so awesome?"
Oh, thanks, bud. I've worked hard to become so. No. Thank you.
All right. So one of them by Socialist Party of America. Do you think that the people of Noah's time could be built or maintained boats of the size of Noah's Ark to have been, especially considering in the modern day we have trouble maintaining large boats without advanced technology? How do you think that such a boat would have been constructed considering the technological gap?
Well, that question doesn't bother me too much because we also can't rebuild the pyramids today. You know what I mean? Like, just about every civilization in the past has had some sort of capacity to construct something we can't do in the modern day. Where, like, we can't make Roman concrete. We can't even make the aquifers they made with the same precision that they did. And we've got, lasers and computers and stuff, and we can't do it. You've got the fact you can't place you can't even place a piece of paper between the granite blocks of the pyramids. You've got all of these
Or
things
Machu
where
Picchu.
compared to yeah, or Machu Picchu. Yeah, there's so many things we can't do that the ancient world was able to do. It's like compared to that, some big boat just doesn't seem, especially because we don't actually even know how big the boat actually was because it was a cubit, right? Like the measurement is like it was so many cubits. Now the problem with a cubit is that usually the length of a cubit is usually from from as Crux was demonstrating from your fingertips to the elbow, basically. Now, of course, back in those days, from what I remember. But now this is a biological thing I'm claiming, which I might be wrong on, but I'm pretty sure people were shorter back then.
Yeah.
The bodies were smaller, so cubits might have just been smaller. It's hard to know.
Right.
So it's entirely, but I would still say the boat would have been pretty big. And in terms of the technology used to construct it, there's lots of things the ancient world could construct we can't. That's all I'd have to
It's
say about
it's
that.
not as big a problem for your version as it is for the young Earth creationists that are taking it all literally. Like, because if it's all literal, then you've got to have it the certain size, and it's gonna fit every animal in the world on it. Like two of every animal, or however they get around that, which doesn't really work. Like that's a massive boat. But if we are saying that like we're using hyperbole and maybe measurement systems and data like ways of measuring everything is different to what we do now, and you don't have every two of every kind of animal on the world, the whole world, that might not have been necessary. If we're talking about a regional flood, then then it becomes more palatable, but there's still issues with it.
I just want
It's
to
a
bring
big
something up quick here. So one thing about wood, of course, is that there is a maximum threshold of how big a boat can get, because at a certain
Yeah.
limit, it does crack right down the center if the
Yeah.
waves are too rough. But anyways, that's my little tidbit.
There's also a twisting feature that happens when you have a large, long boat with long planks of wood that's rolled differently in the ocean. Like we're talking about the ocean, like this, the one that was built in the river, it can go in the river. It's not a problem. Rivers are calm, and perhaps the floodwater had to be tumultuous at one stage. If you got a big boat and you get hit by a wave at this end and not this end, then the wood is going to twist differently. And when they twist, there's gaps and you get flooding. And that's why every time we've tried to do this, those boats have either sunk or not worked. They're not seaworthy.
So there's a question, I got 3 questions from Mark Reed, but I'll space them out. But the first one is for Christian Anarchist. How old do you think the Earth is? Are you a young Earther?
I'm not a young earther. I'm an old earther. I honestly just don't know. I'm probably billions of years old, maybe a couple of hundreds of thousands of years old. I can't. I don't honestly don't know. But I'm not married to any answer one way or another. I'll just listen to where the science says, I guess. Especially because
Not
the creation account, um, it's like even during the second century CE, they were even saying that then Christians like I'm talking about Christians who studied under the apostles, early church fathers were starting to say that this might not have been the beginning of humanity, or that this might not have been the very beginning kind of thing. Um, that's the Earth might be older than because none of the church fathers back then looked at it and said, "Oh, the Earth is 6,000 years old." That's actually like later in the medieval period that people started to say that.
adding up all the years. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can I
but
say
early
something
church
like
fathers, yeah. Oh, sorry.
no, I just want to sort of applaud you for something that is super important in science, but we don't see it in these debates a lot. Is like just saying I don't know. Like I actually that's what I started with. Like I can't prove or disprove anything, and saying I don't know is yeah best answer a lot of the time in science. We don't know. We don't know all the answers. So
Yeah, better to
thanks
be
for that.
honest than to just completely commit to something without any evidence to provide that belief.
I
So
appreciate it a lot. Yeah.
yeah, so there's a question for Cruux here. What would convince you, if anything, that the flood of the Bible narrative was valid?
This discussion, if we were stripping it back to smaller um, scale flood, I don't really have a problem with it. If the date's not a problem and the size of the boat and the hyperbole of the size of the flood, it wouldn't take much to convince me that there's some evidence. Like if you could show me that there's some not geological, because we'd be talking about sediments really if we're not going too far back, some physical evidence of a flood in that region, then I'd be convinced of the validity of the story, but not the event that brought the story about, but not the story itself. If we're taking the Bible literally, then there's probably not a lot you could do at this stage because we don't have the evidence for it. Like a flood is a very high energy event and it's regional. To extrapolate that everywhere at once, we would see the evidence of that. We have evidence of floods straight after the water drains off, and it's got to drain somewhere, so that's your first problem. We see what happens. We see the devastation. We've got to clean the mess up, and this sort of scale flood, it would be that the evidence would still be there, and it's not. That would be my answer. You want to jump
Yeah.
in, Christian? Or?
Oh
Um,
yeah, I was just say just to clarify when we talk about taking the Bible literally, I mean I would only take the Bible literally if it intends to be taken literally. If it uses narrative devices, which are again, like when I just say that the Bible's being hyperbolic when it's saying it's the whole earth. I'm not just trying to pull that out of my ass because it would be like convenient thing. But I'm looking at, well, do we have evidence of the Bible using that kind of thing hyperbolically? And that's where I would go to Exodus 9 and 10, that it does use that kind of language. And it's like, oh, well, there's a pattern here. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't just put that forward. Like there's a evidence of, and I think even outside the Bible, you do see that kind of language. And there's the issue of linguistics of like land versus world kind of thing.
And storytelling to convey a message is something that we've always done as people, and so that's valid. A narrative technique to tell a story is different to a historical narrative, and that in ancient times there wasn't that line. We didn't have a clear-cut thing like you can only say the facts in a historical narrative. Their stories were a combination of this sort of stuff. They did use hyperbole. They did use narrative devices to tell a story they wanted to teach. It wasn't just about history. Like there was no separating it back then. Yeah.
Or if I got a postmodernist in the chat to debate, they'd probably say that there's still no separating it. But that's a debate for another
Yeah. Well,
day.
that's true too. I agree with that too. Got to look at it that way.
Just want to move on to the next question, if you guys don't mind. But another one for Anarchist. What would convince you, if anything, that the flood narrative is simply just a story?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I guess it's kind of hard because I was about to answer that question, and I was like, well, that sounds like trying to prove a negative a bit. Like I guess it's more like because I'm not all that. I'm trying to like gather how I'm gonna word this, where it's like if there was no like fountains of the deep thing, like the thing that sort of caught my attention when researching this thing is like, okay, maybe there's no commitment to it being a worldwide flood. I'm thinking, okay, well then that sort of opens the door to it being valid, right? Um, and then you have the fountains of the deep, and then I researched into it, this underground ocean. It's like, oh, there's like pieces here coming together. Obviously the whole puzzle hasn't been put together by any stretch of the imagination, no matter which direction you want to go. But there's pieces of the puzzle here. And so I guess I would say that in order for it to just be a story, pure myth, I would say that there would have to not be these pieces of the puzzle. And also I would have to see evidence, for example, that when the Bible's saying it is absolutely a worldwide flood, and that either I would expect to see the scientific evidence for that, which Cruux is put forward, that doesning exist, and I'm taking as well. I not that I think he's lying. I think he's telling the truth.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm taking. I think like since that's what the consensus is saying, I'm going to accept that sort of thing. But like I look at the other side and I say, well, it doesn't have to be literally like the whole world, especially when it's like this happens a lot in the Bible where it says the whole world when it really just means the whole land. I think like there's that one point where Jesus is being taken up to a mountain and it says they beheld the kingdoms of the world. Well, obviously they couldn't see every single kingdom from like any mountain. But it was more like that, the conversation they were having was in reference to that they were looking at all the kingdoms, or when it was saying, like again in Exodus 10, like this is a common theme, what you have to remember. I'm starting to ramble a bit, but you have to remember when you're living in a culture that hasn't circumnavigated the globe, you're living in a culture that hasn't discovered every last bit of Earth. What exactly do they mean when they say the world? Like linguistically, that's going to have entirely different connotations that we sort of lost over time. Entirely different sort of sound in your ears, kind of thing. So I guess I would have to see more evidence that it's strictly literal. Oh well, again, not even that it's strictly literal, because I think it's still being kind of literal, but not like. Anyway, I'm rambling, but yeah, sorry.
All right. So just as a reminder, for people that want to ask more questions or whatever, just do at MDD stage questions, and then you can type your question, and it should go to our bot, and we should take care of it there. So now on to the next question. This is from Tinfoil Freak for Anarchist. Wouldn't the construction of the Ark, especially if it was truly as large as the legends say, wouldn't there be archaeological remnants of its construction left over, chopped down forests covered in mud, supports or buildings that would were used to hold up the archaeological, etc.
I don't think so at all. I mean, like, if we're talking about a big wooden structure, like a lot of people are trying to look for Noah's Ark and trying to find the actual boat. Man, if that thing, assuming the wood hasn't rotten, all the wood for it has probably been stolen, heaps, that sort of thing. As for chopped down trees, people have probably replanted over areas, I guess. It depends on how much wood was needed and what kind of wood. Again, we don't know what is meant by gopher wood, so we don't know which forests to look for and which trees should be cleared. And that's not to mention that, again, we're talking about 12,000 years ago. I think a couple of trees might have sprung up in that time, kind of thing. Like of all the kinds of archaeological evidence you'd expect not to have in terms of like what we're able to go out there and find, because when you're talking about archaeological evidence, you're really just looking at the tip of the iceberg of what really is going on, kind of thing. It doesn't, like, the archaeological evidence doesn't give you like the full picture at all. It doesn't even give you half the picture. It's just that we have to draw conclusions based off what picture we do have, obviously, because it's the best we got. But if I was going to say that if there's any missing pieces of the puzzle you'd expect to be missing, it'd be those kinds of things. I wouldn't expect the ark to have its wood not stolen. Of course, people would be doing that.
Another thing to add is that the translation for gopher, the gopher wood and all that stuff, was one of the parts that was not fully translated, whereas the rest of the sentence was. So it's really interesting to see, like, it was just like
No,
one.
that's actually not true. There's
Oh,
rest of the parts of the sentence that are also not necessarily translated well because it uses Akkadian loanwords. So gopher is just one of them. There's another one where I think it says make the rooms of the ark. Now, the Hebrew word that's used for rooms is not used in that place, and we don't actually exactly know. It says, I mean, it might not even be referring to rooms. Like when it says, the ark had rooms, it made it sound like, it doesn't actually use the word for rooms, and it also, I think, and set up its pitch. I think the word pitch is also might have been referring to bitumen. We don't know. Um, like that. So there's several words like just in that one sentence that are Akkadian loan words that we don't know exactly what they mean.
okay, interesting. So the next question, I'm just trying to see who this is for. Oh, it's probably for you, Anarchist, as well. Um, how would 8 people have run and maintained a large wooden vessel, a zoo with thousands of animals, do maintenance, cleaned out all of the animals, provided for them over a year? Do you think 8 people is enough manpower?
There was more than 8 people
Oh,
because you had the sons of Ham and like their clans, I think, where it was like I think you had from what I remember, there was like so it was Noah, his sons, and like all their families basically. And when we're talking families, especially back then, families has much more of an extended connotation. We might be even talking like whole clans kind of thing. Maybe not that huge, but I would certainly say more likely more than 8.
all right.
Which, to be fair, that might actually even have its own set of problems because they would have each of those people would have requirements, but maybe they just ate some of the animals. I don't know.
Interesting. That's the
um,
first. That's really interesting. Um, okay, so the next question we have here is by Tinfoil Freak. We do know how to make the pyramids and Roman concrete. There is very little that we can't make from ancient times.
I think that one of the points there, though, was like replicating it with today's technology is different to using the technology that they would have had available in the past. So I'll jump in and support that one. I think that's where it becomes a bit trickier. But yeah.
All right.
yeah, I mean, like, replicating these things is yeah, because like for example, with the Roman concrete, it's we know, I believe we figured out how they made it. It's using like a particular kind of material that was accessible through like volcanic rock, like, and there was like a powder or something they mixed into the concrete that was from volcanic rock, which was used to give it sort of like a porous quality, I think, and like give it its ability to breathe and everything. So we know how they do it. It's just that they had more abundant materials back then than we do today. So yeah, like so a question of like knowing how it was done versus being able to replicate it. Like this is where, yeah, like Cruux said, it gets a bit tricky.
I think what I heard was that it was the economics issue. Like today, it's just like, yes, we can make the stronger concrete, we can do all that, but at the end, like, you'd probably just switch into a different material at that point if you know. So the idea is it's too expensive, or it's just not worth it to go with all those methods to replicate that or get better quality concrete. There are many different I guess you could say percentages of water and different materials that they add to their that different companies are trying, and yeah, it's interesting to see the differences there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right, and so far, I think I got one more question. I may have more, but I'll have to check the chat in a minute. But all right, see here. There are wooden boats, barges today that are as big, but they need bilge pumps to cope with the water and the torsion effects Cruux described. Did Noah have a bilge pump technology?
Probably not. I don't know what to tell you, man. Like when we're getting into these specific like kinds of details, like when we're zoomed out from this time frame, you know, these are the kinds of details where it's like, uh, I I mean, you know, maybe the gopher wood was of such quality that they didn't need one, or maybe qubits are a lot smaller than we think. I like when it comes to bilge pumps, I'm at a loss here. I'm just, you know, maybe he did have one. You know, I don't even know. I'm going to be completely candid. I don't even know what a bilge pump is. That's the first time I'm hearing of its existence. So, I'm I can't say too much on that.
Yeah.
All right, well,
So it's just to pump the water out from like the bottom of the boat. All boats kind of take on a little bit of water at least, and they just keep sort of cycling it out so it doesn't become too much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fair enough.
I don't know how advanced the technology is though.
Yeah, I don't know.
well, yeah, it's I think that's all the questions that I have on the list, unless anyone else has any last minute questions. But yeah, is there anything else you'd guys like to last minute things you want to add on to wrap this up, or?
I just want to say thanks to everyone because this is my first one on here live like this. I've you know bounced around the VCs and whatnot, but this is what I come on here to do. And then I sort of panicked when I first got here, and it's been really good to do this. And I knew Christian would be a nice civil person to have a conversation with. So I really appreciate everyone that's jumped in and helped today because there's been a few of you still down there in the audience and up the top. Thank you.
Yeah, I also wanted to say thanks for bringing this all together. I reckon this was a pretty, I mean, you know, a pretty awesome debate. I came in, you know, only with a bit of research, a bit out of my depth. You know, Crux, you know, had a lot of really good, interesting insights on the geology, which is, you know, completely out of my depth. So, I mean, I definitely learned something in this debate, which I think is very valuable. Um, so I'm glad it happened. So thanks for everyone who made it happen.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Buff.
Yeah,
Thanks
that
to
was
the mods
wonderful.
down there and to Max who was recording. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and I guess with that, I'm just trying to think of how I would close this, but I think yeah, it's been a wonderful time. This has been a great debate, and I think you guys both did a really good job expressing your points of view
Thank you,
on this.
sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good work. Yeah, and thanks